as we navigate the urgent questions around digital manipulation and national resilience, we reached out to one of Africa's leading voices in cybersecurity and cognitive security. Anna Collard has not only built a successful cybersecurity awareness company that's scaled to global impact, she's also been at the forefront of the human side of cybersecurity, championing digital well-being, cyber psychology, and ethical tech leadership. Currently serving on the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Cybersecurity, Anna brings both technical depth and a rare awareness of how AI affects our minds, our rights, and our sovereignty. And here's what she's had to say about South Africa's digital readiness, the risk of algorithmic discrimination, and why cognitive security might just be our next national defense strategy. Welcome, Anna, to this episode on The Truth Report.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Anna, why has South Africa fallen behind on AI governance, and what do you think the risks of this is for this country at large?
Look, I think South Africa is not the only country that has fallen behind. The whole world is struggling with, keeping up with the pace of technology. The regulators in general are always behind whenever there's a new technology or innovation happening. I think the issue or the challenge that we have in South Africa in particular is, and I can talk more about it from a cybersecurity point of view, is that it just hasn't been prioritized enough. We have things like unemployment, poverty, crime. You have all these like big sort of fires to fight that politicians or regulators may feel are more prominent in the voters' view anyway than tackling technological challenges, which are obviously just as important, but unfortunately, and this is not just South Africa, it's on the African continent in general, tech and cyber and AI and anything related to, let's call them the virtual risks, have been under prioritized.
And do you think we're quite close to seeing AI being weaponized in South Africa in terms of election risks?
Oh, yeah. Again, not just in South Africa, globally, and then in terms of AI being used. And I think we have to, before I go into what I mean by that, is that AI and algorithmic technology, machine learning, that's been around for many, many years. I think the whole buzzword and what everybody's talking about now in terms of manipulation is generative AI. So the use of, creating, for example, deepfakes, which are AI-generated media, whether that's video or voice, to impersonate existing celebrities, for example, or politicians, or actually anyone really for that matter, for malicious purposes. In terms of, it being used for political manipulation, I think even before generative AI was so accessible, we've seen Russia meddling on the continent a lot with disinformation campaigns. We've seen even last year in South Africa's elections, disinformation being used with or without the use of deepfakes, right? I mean, that's something, by the way, that I feel quite strongly about, is that the AI or the deepfake, whether that's an image or an audio file, is just an artifact that is being used in a bigger manipulative storyline. And the storyline, the storytellers, that's the problem. The fact that they're using AI artifacts. I mean, we've seen it with Trump, when he was ambushing Ramaphosa and, about this whole white genocide happening, he used a real image in the wrong context. And that's also being deception. If you use real, authentic media in the wrong context, like in this case, he used an image of, I believe it was the Congo, like some massacre happening in Congo, but using it in the story of the white genocide being happening in South Africa. So AI by itself is not the problem necessarily. It amplifies and it scales a lot of the, let's call them the manipulative actors and their ability. But the real problem is the deceptive storylines that are being told and the manipulators themselves.
Wow, that's actually quite interesting. And would you say that, I mean, is there a way to get around that, or are we just going to be victims of our own circumstance?
No, I definitely feel that's something I feel quite strongly about is when you mentioned it in the beginning, cognitive security as a national defense. Like if we look at countries, for example, Finland, Ukraine, Taiwan, that had to invest in their citizens' critical thinking ability because they've been under, let's call them disinformation and propaganda threats for many years. They've identified it's important to skill up their citizens to identify or detect when a deceptive storyline is being told, whether that's using AI or not, right? And the way they do it, if you look at Finland, for example, which is fantastic, by the way, and they make it all available to the public. They have a really good playbook where educators from, like, let's call it kindergarten level all the way through, teach the students or the kids how to think critically and, for example, verify if you read an article in your local press to see, well, what's the narrative, what's the idea behind it, what are they trying to tell us, and then to also read the same story in 2 or 3 different like other publications, preferably even other countries, to really, really cultivate that, what I call digital mindfulness, that ability to not just consume media, but to be able to realize when something is emotionally triggering, when something is trying to tell a story that either tries to manipulate me to believe in something that's maybe not necessarily my best interest, or trying to, which is what the scammers are using, is trying to get me to do something that's not in my best interest. And that cognitive ability or flexibility, like they also call it cognitive flexibility, to realize that when I'm being, when I'm consuming content, that's actually trying to do something with me, and then to halt and to pause and to say, well, let me, before I react impulsively, before I share this, or reply with like all capital letters because it's rousing my emotions, to realize, hang on a moment, maybe because it's so emotional, because it's so powerful, because it's confirming my existing belief system, my biases, I should pause and slow down and verify before I reacted. So that was a long-winded response, but yeah, it is definitely something we can do more about it. We are not powerless, but it requires, first of all, an understanding that it's the thing, and that we need to invest more in our citizens' cognitive abilities to slow down.
In particular, our youth, I would imagine, who are caught so much up into it. Wow, that's very interesting. And then going back, Anna, to policy, the policy space. I mean, I'm quite critical of the regulators because unfortunately the regulators are not independent. Technically, they're usually sponsored by the very companies that they're supposed to regulate against or regulate on. Who regulates the regulators? And how effective are our regulators in South Africa when it comes to AI, deepfake, and, really looking after individual rights of citizens?
Yeah, I guess at the moment, South Africa, from a regulative point of view, we've got some great, let's call them bare bone infrastructure. We've got the POPIA Act, we've got Consumer Protection Act, we have a bunch of really good legal frameworks. From an AI point of view, we don't really have anything in place just yet. Again, that's not necessarily a South African only problem, it's a global problem. I mean, the EU, with the EU, the AI Act is sort of the only one forging ahead with some good regulations. But even there, it's one thing to have something on paper, and then how do you actually enforce it, which is always in a South African context the same issue, right? Like we might have good laws on paper, but it lacks in execution. In terms of your question, like who regulates the regulator, I think that's often, particularly in sort of digital spaces, you have to bring in civil society. You have to bring in like something with let's call it like a self-regulating enforcement tool where people have the power to question, and like in any democratic society or system where you have others, or even the civilians themselves being able to to raise questions and participate.
Do you think that we should have an independent AI regulatory body in South Africa? Or
I think so. Yes. I mean, look, like if we look at again from a privacy point of view, and the POPIA Act, we do have the data protection regulator, and I think we do need something like that also from a AI ethics enforcement point of view, but not just not just the government regulator per se, but working together with like sort of watchdogs and cross-sector collaboration. So, and again, I think South Africa, we are actually, particularly if we now compare it to what's going on in the States, right, and other sort of more authoritarian environments, we do have some great base points in place, right? Like, yes, we know where yet in terms of the actual execution from a law enforcement or even a regulator point of view, but I do believe that we have South Africans generally have that yes, to speak out when things are wrong, and they're not scared of the government. So I think that is a great advantage that we have as a society. Yeah.
That's actually true. We should capitalize on that more and bring that into the policy-making space, where you've got something similar to what X does in terms of community notes. So almost self-regulation by the people, for the people. Do you believe, and it's a worrying thing watching how quickly AI is exponentially growing every 3 months in terms of its ability to think. And is ignorance becoming a national threat? Because we just haven't even started at step 101 yet.
I believe it's definitely a threat on so many levels. If we start off with just digital inclusion, like we do have to make sure you're not left behind as a let's call it African or global South player. So that's where it starts off, is ensuring that people actually get access to the technology and are not left behind, but then also access in terms of being part of the development space. Generally, if you look at who makes those rules, who writes those algorithms, it's just call it as it is. It's white male Caucasians, right? With a few Asians mixed in, but there's not much female or African representation. So we do need to make sure we're sitting at those tables, not just from a technical point of view, by the way, also from a regulatory point of view, from a global kind of ethics, and whether it's privacy, safety, security, all of these kind of rules, which I am a huge believer in, that we have to have regulation. You cannot have an environment that just allows free fall, and at the end of the day just enables the criminals and the let's call them predatory advertising and for profit only organizations. Like you have to have boundaries in place, because at the end of the day, the people that will suffer the most are the vulnerable ones, are the ones that don't know better. And yeah,
absolutely. And talking about that global South versus let's talk about LLMs, and it's a mirror of what we put in. So if you've got 80% of first world countries putting in info, it's certainly not going to reflect inequalities that sit on the continent of Africa. So I always ask the question, why I actually speak about this publicly, is about, are we baking discrimination into our future? I mean, how do we stop that?
Again, I believe that in regulating transparency and holding the parties responsible for making sure that this is being addressed and is not an issue. I really like the way the EU has sort of structured their EU AI Act by 3 different types of risks. So if you have high risk systems that that impact people's lives and decisions around whether you, let's say, for example, whether you can get access to policies or certain things, that's high risk, it's high impact. So they're definitely the owners is on the organizations that profit from using those systems to make sure that there's no biases baked in, and that they're audited for this, and again, the companies wouldn't do that unless a regulator will tell you, hey, you shall do so, because obviously baking in governance and security and checking and audits, that's costly, it's resource intensive, it delays the project. And if I just want to go live with my latest new LLM shiny toy and sell my product, I'm not going to do those things unless I'm being told so. And that's where I feel so strongly that we need regulation.
Yeah, no, that's actually true. It's almost like we need AI to be put into King 4, as a form of governance model, should be included into any corporation's strategy that is audited on a yearly basis.
100%. And to be honest, in some way it is, because if you look at King 4, they speak about risk management, right? And digital risk is part of your overall director's duty to handle risk and be aware of risk. So AI just becomes another extension of those digital systems that we use. So they should already, take the responsibility for it. But it doesn't, and this is always the issue with the, let's call them the lawmakers versus technology, right? Like the law has to be it can't be that specific. I can't specify in a law, you shall audit your LLMs for, it because like technology moves on too quickly. So they keep it more generic, saying, well, make sure you identify and manage risks adequately or appropriately, and then your industry specific regulations would then say, well, what does adequately really mean? Is this a specific encryption algorithm, or is it and because those things change so fast. But this is, and I think this is where, particularly in our industry in cyber, there's a lack of people who really understand this, right? And you do need to have people who understand that if something is a generic sounding risk management kind of phrase, what does that mean in terms of the technology right now and best practices, and how do we actually execute and implement across all the different technologies?
Sure. And the most important, our data. I mean, I'm sure that our data has been used to mold LLMs. Where does the protection of the individual, rights come into play here? And should we really have an AI Bill of Rights? Because, I have no idea how much my data has been farmed across the world.
And it is, I mean, I have friends who are authors who found their whole books online, right? Like being used by these let's call them crawlers and LLM, like OpenAI being one of them, right? So, and again, I'm referring to the EU so much, but they have outlined copyright issues, intellectual property as being one of the things that need to be addressed by an AI code of ethics. And so it should. I mean, it's heartbreaking to think about the creative industry and the artists, the authors whose work is just being, used without paying for it, and it's wrong. In terms of your data, I've just recently finished reading a fantastic book, by the way, called The Coming Wave, and I have to look up the author, but in it, like, he sort of outlines the risks, not just related to like AI, taking over, etc., etc. It was more about what's already happening. If you look at China, for example, where they are like the prototype in terms of what's possible when a authoritarian regime or system is effectively using the technology and the AI for their purposes, for their control. And I mean, if you go to China, like, everyone's using WeChat for everything, right? Like for their banking, for their shopping, for their chatting, for everything. And why? Because that's easy to monitor and to control then, right? They have access to the biggest sort of street monitoring, surveillance systems that look for people's facial recognition, even the way we walk. They collect all of that, and they have this massive, massive database of what's going on with their citizens, which they say, well, they do it for counterterrorism, but a terrorist in China is someone that may, I don't know, may be interested in democratic ideals, right? So it becomes very scary when we think about what these regimes can do with access to this powerful technology. It's not just the AI, it's also the sort of big data and being able to actually sift through all of this and creating these profiles about us. And then even in systems that are maybe not authoritarian, but that might just use it for commercial purposes, and they buy this technology from the Chinese or from these companies, and then inadvertently they support these structures that. And I know I'm sounding very utopian, like sort of conspiracy theorist, but I'm not. Like this is happening already, right? Like in China, this is happening. They had the Great Firewall for many years. It's not a new thing. It's just now that they have so much more power to survey and control their citizens.
Oh, finally. And thanks, Anna. Finally, I wanted to just ask you, do you think democracy can survive synthetic manipulation? I mean, we're all in the same boat here on the planet. Or do you think we're just going to evolve into a new kind of democracy with a whole lot of more control and mechanisms of surveillance?
Yeah, such a good question, because and like if you look at for example, Russia, right? And I've just did a little piece a few days ago for a Ukrainian reporter who was looking into the story of how Russian propaganda on Telegram is influencing teenagers in the Ukraine to basically get them to sabotage their own military operations and then take videos of themselves, which Russia then again uses internally as part of their propaganda. And it's so scary how the teenagers may initially they just join some sort of Telegram channel, believing that this is part of the Ukrainian communication. Meanwhile, it's all sort of linked to Russian networks and being sort of infiltrated with Russian propaganda messaging. And also, by the way, Russia is feeding a lot of data, like for example, into Wikipedia and all these kind of sources to poison the Western LLMs, because they get the information from the web, right? And now, if you're a strategic disinformation propagandist, what do you do? You poison at the source, right? So this is again, this is happening right now, that democratic values and belief systems are being undermined by these regimes strategically. Like we really think, and I know that they Putin or Russia isn't maybe that strong from a military point of view, but they're very, very strong in what's called hybrid warfare, where they use information, disinformation, propaganda to undermine the enemies from within, and basically overthrow those democratic values and create polarization, all of that. So this is happening already. And even and I don't know how, like, your listeners in terms of political affinity, but I feel from a manipulation point of view, Trump is just the absolute he epitomizes what propaganda and manipulation through storytelling, the way he talks, the way the symbols he uses, those are all tactics that are being used or based on playbooks that have been around since the 1800s, like Le Beau, what's his name? Yeah, it's Le Beau who wrote The Crowd, which is like a blueprint of how to influence people that was used by the Nazis, being used for so many horrible sort of influencing campaigns all over, way before AI was around. It's just that AI and technology now helps those actors, I call them adversaries, but those actors to gain even more power. But the tactics, the manipulative tactics that have been used, the storytelling, that's old. I mean,
Sure.
they feed into biases like Trump again, why does he repeat everything that he says 3 times? We might think because he's a bit of a moron, but he's not. He does that on purpose, because the more often you hear something, it affects how we believe. That's called the illusory truth, the truth effect. Like, if you hear something multiple times, you tend to believe it, even if in the beginning you didn't believe it, right? Yeah. So there's so much at play here that is so sort of subvert. That is so kind of under the radar. And the one thing that we can do, and as I've, is raising awareness and teaching people how this manipulative game, how that works, how it's feeding into our existing belief systems, how they cherry pick data. Same with all the other conspiracy theorists. When whoever they use the data that fits them, and so much has to go into, again, coming back to the beginning of our conversation, teaching our youth, teaching the citizen, teaching our people how to spot these manipulative tactics. It's more important than, hey, can you spot a deepfake or not? Yeah. That's a deepfake or not, who cares? Let's be honest, anything that we see nowadays, like the Zoom interview, there's some filter on Zoom that's AI generated, makes me look a bit better. So it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether something is AI generated or not. What the question we need to ask is always, what's the intent behind the story? What are they trying to get me to believe or do? And whether it's the AI generated or not is by the by. It's really being aware of the manipulation that's happening.
Oh, that's actually amazing. Thank you so much, Anna. That was deeply insightful perspective from Anna Collard, one we don't hear very often, Anna. The reality is that cybersecurity is no longer just about firewalls and passwords, as you've mentioned. As you've just heard, it's about safeguarding our cognition, our identities, and that invisible architecture that now mediates trust in a digital society. When AI begins to predict, to influence, and even decide on our behalf without transparency or accountability, we're no longer dealing with innovation. We're dealing with governance, as we'd like to say, and ethics, as you've mentioned, and in some cases, psychological sovereignty. And what's really stood out from your comments, Anna, is that our national resilience won't come solely from legislation. It really is or just new technology. It will come from awareness, from educating citizens, from cultivating mindfulness in digital spaces and embedding psychological safety into our systems from the ground up. So you've also stated that South Africa is not exempt from these challenges. And in fact, we might be more vulnerable given our socio-political history and our digital divide. But perhaps really that what makes us more uniquely positioned to pioneer a different kind of AI future, one that places humanity, justice, and consciousness at our center. So let's not wait for synthetic crisis to force our hand. Let's architect the safeguards now. And I really like the idea that we should be educating children with awareness from a very, very young age. Thank you very much, Anna Collard, for your contribution to the Truth Report.